So we're recording in case people miss it. So I'm Renee Skaggs with the Pierce Conservation District, and if you're not familiar with conservation districts, we were established after the Dust Bowl to prevent man-made natural disasters from occurring again, which is basically what the Dust Bowl was. So we are here to give you farming best practices, to keep your soil in place, to keep the water clean, but hopefully bonus, you will also have more productive and healthy for you and your animals. So we are all about voluntary compliance and giving you ideas. We're not regulators, so we will tell you if you're doing something that is against county code or what have you, but we're not going to turn you in. So we love to do site visits. We don't like to spend all of our days in the office, so we love to come out and do walk and talks and walk around your property and give you ideas. And one of the cool things is we get to work with WSU Extension we're kind of the mouthpiece for all of their research. So that's why I've invited Joe Harrison here in the room, and Chris Benedict, top right with the almost white beard, to be our speakers. They did some research on growing alternative fodders and feeding them a couple of years ago. So they're going to talk about their project. And then Cody Wood, who was here on the couch and popped up, is a grower down in Oregon. He has sheep and he has actual experience in growing and feeding it, and he is doing it to provide year-round forage for his sheep. So Cody's going to talk about his experiences. So if you didn't hear it earlier, there's Cody. If you didn't hear me earlier, everybody that's not a presenter, if you can mute yourselves while you're listening to presentations. If you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, and that'll kick the microphone back over to you. And then we'll answer, and then mute yourself again, and we'll proceed like that. Hopefully it's going to work. And then questions all obviously at the end also. So anybody have any questions before we start? And if you don't know Robin Buckingham, he's the Puyallup Watershed planner, so I'd be happy to assist you in doing all the things that we want you to do.
So maybe get an idea from folks.
Oh yes, sorry for that.
Who's had experience or is planning on using fodder beets or something similar this year. So you're ready to plant.
I'm ready to plant. I have fodder beets and turnips, Fisher turnips.
You're out near Lake Bay, right?
Yeah, I'm in North Branch.
Anybody else experience or can you try it this year?
Anybody on the phone that has had experience growing? Cody, yes. Okay, what kind of livestock? So cattle, okay, sheep, okay, goats, okay, horses. All right, so we got a little of everything. Am I missing alpacas? You need to do chickens, alpacas, llamas, that sort of stuff. Okay, so Chris Benedict is at WSU Extension Mount Vernon, and I will let you say as much or as little as you want to about yourself, Chris, but we will let you take over from here.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep, okay, great. So I'm actually based in Bellingham. I'm in the extension office just about half an hour north and largely work in Whatcom County, mostly with berry and seed potato growers, but we get involved in a little bit of everything, as you'll see today. So first of all, thanks for letting me do this remotely. It saved me the trip, but it sounds like this might become more norm in our life based on what's going on around the country. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into a presentation that's going to kind of go through several different components and talk a little bit about just some information that that we've scoured from various resources, but also some results from some trials that I'll talk about that Joe was involved in as well. And as Renee pointed out, if there's any questions, just stop us as we go, and we'll take them at that point in time. Sound good? Hearing nothing, we'll keep going. So this is going to a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to go a little bit of history because I think it's relevant here. And then I'll get into some crop production information. I don't know if Renee was able to supply some of those extension fact sheets that I sent earlier, but this information is largely derived from those. And that information really was derived from the best bit of information that we had about in 2010 when we started pulling those together. And what's really important is that the U.S. is really far behind the rest of the world on this information, well, particularly New Zealand and the U.K. And so those are really good sources of information if you go to sort of track that stuff down. This is just a short video. I'm not really... So cows, this is a trial that I'll talk about that we did in the Snoqualmie Valley, working with some beef cattle on, these are fodder beets, but we'll come back to this. I'll also get into some specific trials that we ran in 2011, 2012. I actually first started working at WSU in the Puyallup Valley, and one of the impetus for pulling this work together was some feedback from a bunch of different farmers that I was interacting with. And so the trials actually started out on the Key Peninsula and the Puyallup Valley, but evolved to really focus on the Snoqualmie Valley and up in Mount Vernon for logistical reasons because I had moved up north. Okay, so just a little bit of background. This is kind of interesting. Largely, I'm going to talk about 4 different types of alternative forage or fodder crops. The fodder beet is probably the most well known, and it's been used for a very long time period. Turnips probably used the longest. They were utilized for animal feed since the 1400s, and in fact, the USDA had an active breeding program into the 1970s. And this pretty much eliminated with really the large onset of grain and corn as a feedstock in soybeans. But it was also used in a role as a pasture renovation, which I'll talk about here a little bit later. And then rutabaga, or sometimes referred to as a Swede. This is a wild cabbage and turnip. And of course, we all recognize these crops because humans consume them more readily, and that's where most of the breeding efforts are really targeted for the fresh consumption by humans. Kale, we'll talk about that. Again, there was an active USDA breeding program until the 1970s, but since then, really it's the private industry that has led that effort. So what's really nice about these crops is that they're adapted to cool, moist climates. That's why they're used in places like the UK. And as you can see, these are actually images that I got from Pullman that were taken. This is taken in the Puyallup Valley in the 1930s. A gentleman growing a fodder beet right there, very well dressed, as I will point out. And then this is some storage testing that was done with just basically putting these crops in piles. This is up in Whatcom County, actually. Both of these are from about the 1930s. But they were commonly replaced in the 50s with when corn and grains kind of came along. And sort of the scaling up of the industry sort of took place. But as I mentioned, they're still really commonly used in other places in Europe, particularly, and in New Zealand. And so there's really good production information there. Sometimes not all of it is I wouldn't say scientifically based, so you have to take a little bit with a grain of salt, but there are some good resources out there. Okay, so this is what I'm really going to focus on today. And I mentioned what was sort of the reason for doing some of this work was really to try to find crops that people could grow in Western Washington that do well here, where they're operating a farm that may be growing vegetables alongside livestock. So they have the understanding and knowledge of how to grow vegetables, but they may not have the scale to grow something like corn or grains. And so what can we do to really offer some alternatives. And so we look at things like fodder beets. I mentioned these before, rutabagas, turnips, and there's various types of turnip, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and then kales. And you can easily grow kale, turnip, rutabaga, fodder, beets that you grow for human consumption and feed them to animals, but they've not been selectively bred for high quality production, but also high quantity production, but also high quality, particularly for feeds. So these are some references. I think I sent them to Renee. Hopefully, you can find them online. I can pull those up later if people are interested. What's that?
I printed them out.
Oh, great, thanks.
I'll send them to everybody that's on calling in.
Oh, cool. So these are basic information. They're getting close to the cycle of needing to be updated, particularly with some of the trial work that we have. But they were really just kind of literature searches of drawing information in from existing other resources. But what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 or so minutes really is just a highlight of the information that's in those. So you'll be able to reference back to that information outside of this presentation. So when we talk about fodder beets, there really are 4 major different types. And this actually references all beets. And it refers to the shape and size of the root itself. The first being that flat globe, where you have that flat, the surface that usually sits at or below the soil surface, and then is rounded up above that. The second is a cylinder, and these typically are yellow or golden, as I showed in that previous image. And then the third is a typical globe. This is generally more rounded, and these come in all different color flashes. And then the spindle, these are really narrow. They tend to be long orange and red. These the last type tend to produce more above ground biomass than root. And we'll talk about that later. That's kind of an interesting point when you start talking about using these crops. Okay, so I'm going to sort of go through this formulaic, and talk about where these crops do best and what to kind of keep an eye out for. They do very well in a wide range of soils. We're talking about fodder beets. Well drained is ideal, and that's for most crops. A pretty neutral pH. Phosphorus is typically a limiting nutrient, and something you have to keep an eye out on. These fertilizer recommendations are based off of OSU, and these are typically, but obviously a soil test will play a role into that. For soil-borne disease purposes, a 3-year rotation is suggested. Also, most of these crops are direct seeded. One, you could transplant something like kale, but it's going to obviously raise your costs, and so that's something just to consider. As a result of being direct seeded, they're going to be really weak competitors with weeds, particularly for the first 30% or so of their lifespan. And so that's really quite important when you start to think about taking on growing some of these, is that you have to have a plan for managing weeds. I can't emphasize that enough. A little bit more details here. Thin, loose seed bed is preferred, as you can kind of see here. This is, even a little bit clumpy. This is a silt loam up in the Skagit Valley, and this soil does crust over, so it can be a problem. Place the seed about 3/4 to an inch deep, and typically anywhere from 18 to 40-inch row spacing. That's a big difference. I'm going to come back to this later, but of course this depends on what equipment you have available. Typically seed anywhere between 28 and 50,000 seeds per acre. So that should give you a good idea how to estimate how much seed you might need. In soil temperature, germination can occur as low as 50 degrees. So that's fairly early on in the season. We see those temperatures as early as late March in Western Washington. To grow a full-size crop, this usually takes between 60 and 110 days. So 60 is that, and that's from emergence. It's not from seeding. And that will be for all of the values that I'll talk about. They typically produce 4+ pounds per root. and their potential yield is higher than corn. And this is referring to fresh weight, which is very important when we talk about that. We talk about quality later. Any questions at this point? Okay, I'm just going to keep hammering through. So here's some, this is some images. This is from Jubilee Farm. This is one of the farm collaborators we use in the Snoqualmie Valley. You can see these are planted in rows that are about close to 20 inches apart. And they're on beds. And this farmer, he grows a lot of annual vegetables, and so they have that equipment. This was seeded with a Planet Junior seeder, which is pretty common. And you can see this is what resulted from that, was a pretty uniform, pretty good size, just for scale. That's about, oh, it's hard to read. I'd say almost 2 feet high of just vegetation above ground. And then you have that long, narrow root. This is, this is red mammoth fodder beet, which is a variety that you can get at a lot of different places. But you'll see here that there's nice, pretty big root system there. Now I'm going to refer back to this trial later, so let's keep this image in your mind. This, however, this is WSU Mount Vernon. We used a grain drill to see this. That's probably fairly obvious because these rows are, just about 4 inches apart. But we wanted to sort of press these to see maybe where these might work better. A lot of people have access to a drill, but not necessarily a vegetable seeder. So this is a good trial. I will mention that from the beginning of this whole work, the feedback that we heard from growers is that this has got to be as low input as possible. Can I grow these without supplemental irrigation? Can I grow these with minimal fertilizer inputs, that sort of thing? And so we were kind of really pressuring these crops to do well under very trying conditions, as we'll see a little bit later. And as you can see here, because of the in-row and between-row pressure, plants grew much more leggy. They upwards of 30 inches tall, same variety, and they grew much more slender, longer roots. And that's just simply from the competition that would occur around them. So typically these come out in October, but it depends on when you're planting. Most recommendations is to remove the tops unless you're planning to feed that. And the question of harvest equipment, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the literature suggests that palatability increases during storage. Let's switch gears here and look at turnips. Just like fodder beets, there are 5 different turnip shapes. They're the long. These are typically 3 times as long as wide. There's the tankard, which is more uniform. There's the round, which tend to sit at or above the soil. This is important if you're trying to feed your animals directly, allow them to graze directly in the field. Globe, they tend to be more frost hardy. And then flat, they're wider than they are long. So they're kind of the opposite of the long. There's both white and yellow flesh. This is purple top turnip, beautiful turnip. This was actually grown out on the Key Peninsula at a trial out there. They also can deal with a wide range of soils, but again, well drained is ideal. They can deal with a little bit lower pH and prefer that. Again, thin, loose seedbed is preferred, and you're going to see these a little bit more shallow. Their seed is a little bit smaller than fodder beets at a lower rate, about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of seed per acre. Now this can vary depending on what you're trying to do and what variety you're growing, but this is based off of some seed companies that we were working with. Row spacing, so this is between row spacing, 12 to 36 inches, so a little bit narrower than the fodder beet, but again, this is going to depend on the equipment that you have available. And also a recommended 3-year rotation for soil-borne disease purposes. Here are the fertilizer recommendations as well. You do want to watch your soil sulfur levels. We'll come back to this when we talk about feed quality. Again, they can germinate at relatively cool soil temperatures. This is one advantage compared to corn, where it's going to require a little bit warmer temperatures. So there is a little bit of a benefit there. Comparing the two. They can be planted in the spring, summer, or even in the fall. I've seen, there's one grower up here that does use these fairly regularly, and they they tend to plant anywhere as late as early September for a really quick planting. But they've also got really well drained soils, so they can be grown as short. They can be harvested as early as 45 days, but up to about 80 days. And that's for pulling out of the ground or grazing them. They're gonna provide about 3 to 4 tons per acre of dry matter. And typically the tops are removed if you're planning to store them, which of course brings about a whole number of other additional issues that you have to deal with. Mm-hmm. So this one's kind of interesting. And this is, I got really excited about this when we started looking at these. These are hybrid brassicas. This is a cross between a turnip and rapeseed. And one thing that you'll notice right off the bat is that it has a very small root system. These have been selected to produce a lot of above ground biomass. This particular variety is called Paja. It's used a lot in New Zealand. These are much easier to use on a drill because of the fact that they're not really focusing on producing a large, wide root. And of course, if you're broadcasting seed, what you can do, you do want to increase that seeding rate. These can be grazed as early as, actually it should say 40 days. I apologize about that. Upwards of 70 days. So a very short time period from emergence. I mean, that's a little over a month having access to plant material. And these can be regrazed as long as you get the animals through there relatively quickly and don't let them keep chomping on them. They can be regrazed, so they'll actually regrow multiple times in a season. And just a suggestion is a 5-year rotation, good to break up the crop. And as I mentioned, these produce very little root material. So a big note here is that with any of the brassicas, you have to be very cautious with feeding these. And if Joe wants to chime in on this, this would be a good thing to talk about later. You want to slowly introduce them, and typically it's recommended to mix them with other hay and pasture if you're grazing them. And some of the literature suggests that you might have to supplement iodine, as well as dairy cattle these should not be fed this during breeding season. And it can provide an off flavor in milk.
Rapeseed component?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Is that due to the co-breeding with rapeseed, which has a toxin?
Yeah, it has to do, and Joe, this might be a good, you might want to answer this, but it just has to do with some of I think it's the glucosinolates that are in brassicas that can cause an issue, right, Joe?
Yep.
So one thing to note here about brassicas, and if anyone grows brassicas in really most of the US, but really in Western Washington, is you're gonna have flea beetle problems. And while these are an indirect pest, they do reduce the quality of feed. As you can see, that's that kind of, I'll zoom in on here a little bit. You can see these shot hole marks here. That's the feeding that's resulting from that. And there's ways to get around managing that, but it's just something that you have to be cognizant of. Okay, Rutabaga. Again, water-rich soil is well drained, little bit lower pH, about a ½ inch deep. Again, that cool soil, relatively cool soil temperature. These can be planted, this should say March, apologies, up through June. And this variety, Major Plus, has been selected for feeding the animals and produces an enormous root. 1 to 5 pounds of seed per acre, so it can be relatively low. Typically about a little over a foot a row width. A little bit longer growing season than what we're just talking about with the hybrid Brassica. And these can be grazed as well, about 12 inches. And you don't want to get below 5 inches if you plan to have it regrow and to have access to that plant material again. Just like most of these crops, these are weak competitors with weeds. And you just have to have a plan to deal with them. Again, because of the genetics, you're going to want to watch your soil sulfur levels. And these have better storability than turnips. And that's referring to longevity than the quality. And lastly, kale. A little bit, again, that lower pH, 6 to 6.5, you're really at neutral there, close to it. Seeding depth is pretty shallow. And again, those cooler soil temperatures. You're starting to see a theme with a lot of these crops is that they do fairly well in our cooler climates here. And that's really probably one of the big advantages. And as I mentioned, a lot of people are also have the knowledge and the equipment to grow vegetables. And so this is kind of a natural fit in some ways. 2.5 to 5 pounds per acre. 85 to 100 days to harvest. This is for full maturity. You really got to keep a check on phosphorus, potassium, just because these plants are really sensitive to low levels. Typically the 5-year rotation is recommended with kale just because of particularly they're highly susceptible to club root. And if you do have that, all brassicas are susceptible, but kales particularly. You really should be on a 7-year rotation, which can be like a deal breaker for a lot of people, particularly smaller landowners. This is a variety that's been bred. It's called Kestrel. We'll see this later as well. Yeah, I guess we'll play these. This is some.
Yeah, I just don't know that area very much.
It's an amazing spot.
Oh, it is. It's beautiful.
I'll tell you, it's just.
Sorry.
You know, we were up there on Monday.
I didn't realize. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
We heard both of them at the same time.
No, but can you hear the sound on the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
You could just see.
Apologies. That's So what we did here is this: we grew these up, and we just gave free access to a section to see how the cows sort of were interested in it. And you can see that they're, as is typical, they're just randomly eating around. It's not a very efficient way of getting access to that, and a lot goes to waste. And so what happened the following year is the farmer went through and apologies, used strip grazing. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later to try to control access so that the animals would eat all the plant material before kind of moving on. So I'm going to show some, this is obviously a much larger scale, but I want to show some mechanization on the harvest end, because getting that root material out of the field, that is part of your plan, is going to be an issue. And you're going to have to deal with it, particularly if you start scaling this up. And so I looked and grabbed some images from some harvesters from around the world. And one thing that is pretty commonly used is to get access, for example, if you're growing fodder beets, is to get access to a sugar beet harvester. These are actually relatively inexpensive and can be used on a relatively small scale because the industry has gotten so big. As long as you find an older one, they can be used for this for harvesting fodder beets. There's root-only harvesting equipment. I mentioned sugar beets, but there's also whole plant harvesters. They pull and hold onto both the top and root simultaneously. Typically, either in sugar beet harvesters, they go through and mow first, or it's actually removing the material, the plant above ground plant material before separating the root from it. But these can obviously get quite big. This is what they're doing in England. When we're talking about, that's where this industry, particularly in fodder beets, is probably at its pinnacle. It's all heavily mechanized. And you can see these look a lot like some of the potato harvesters that you might see up in the Skagit Valley. This is an interesting piece of equipment. If you do get into this and you do plan on, harvesting the root material and storing it, is a bucket loader that has an auger and a grinder into it. So you can scoop up and feed directly, as I think I'm going to show. Yeah. I'm just going to fast forward through this. I don't think there's any sound on this. That sound. So in this case, this is these are fodder beets. Okay, I can't fast forward through
Well, welcome
this.
to Glorious.
I guess I can. But what you'll see is that the
Stay on
gentleman
farm,
that drove
sun's
the
out at last. Had quite a few
this kid is
overcast days, so it's quite nice to actually see the
trying to get to
sun.
the,
So Dad's just loaded up with a.
apparently won't let me. But what he did is he literally went through the stalls and was just using that auger on there to grind up the material and drop it right into the feeding area. So if this is something you're really interested in, you can scale it up. And I realize that not everyone has that land access or capacity, but it is doable. So something to consider.
Bucket full of fodder.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears here and talk about the trials. Is there any questions at this point, up to this point? Okay, I'll just keep coming along. So as I mentioned, we performed some field trials at a commercial farm in the Snoqualmie Valley and in WSU Mount Vernon, which is these two locations were down south, pretty much outside of Seattle, and then up at the research center in Mount Vernon. And these were done under very different conditions. The commercial farm, this was kind of it was an interest, but not a priority. I'll put it that way. And whereas at Mount Vernon, we could kind of control everything, and so we were on top of several different things that kind of made things more complicated at Jubilee. So we looked at several different crops. First of which is purple top turnip, and then Pasha, that's that hybrid. We trialed chicory for 1 year because of some interest. And then we looked at the variety Maris kestrel kale, and then 2 different fodder beets, Mammoth Red, which is shown here, and then Yellow Cylindrical. And then Major Plus in 2011 only at Mount Vernon. The goal here was to look at, okay, how well do these crops perform in terms of yield, but also the quality of the feeding material that comes out of that. Okay, I realize this is really busy. It's all right. I'm going to highlight what I want you to look at here. So we've got our 2 different years here. There's 2011, then 2012, and then we have our 2 different sites: Jubilee Farm. So this is the commercial farm, and then WSU Mount Vernon. What I want to point out here is a couple things. First of all, is our targeted planting rates. You can see that these are anywhere between 1 and 11 kilograms per hectare. Okay, and then you can see our actual planting rates. This is 2011 at Jubilee. You can see that in some cases, it's up to 5 times the seeding rates. Now, what happened here is that, as I mentioned, a vegetable seeder was used, and the farmer collaborator had not did not calibrate the equipment, and as a result, we put on a lot more seed than we had expected or planned to, and this will of course affect the results here in a second. But with our grain drill at Mount Vernon, we were still 14% or so greater than we were targeted in some cases, but we were much closer. And of course, this is going to affect a bunch of different things in terms of yield. And then in 2012. You could see that we used, at Jubilee, we used a grain drill and got really, really close. I was pretty impressed by the collaborator to do that. And again, we were still elevated, but still pretty close. And that just had to come down to really lack of experience. So the take-home message here is 2011, we had high seeding rates, and in some cases exceedingly high seeding rates. But we were able to better dial it in by 2012. Planting densities are going to affect total yield, but they're also going to impact the root to shoot biomass ratios, which are going to be important when you're talking about trying to emphasize one or over the other. And this is due to competition issues that can arise. So this is just some yields. I'm gonna walk you through all of this, but these are, and really it's the larger take-home message, not necessarily the numbers here. What you're seeing here in the black is the root, the percent, the amount of, this is dry weight, so we take out all the moisture when we're showing this, and then the shoot. And what you can see is is when you have more gray than black is you have a higher shoot to root ratio, okay? And this is Jubilee Farm in 2011. First going to point out Maris Kestrel Kale doesn't produce any root material really at all. I mean, it does produce roots, but we're not really harvesting that or focused on that. Taja, that hybrid Brassica, you can see that has a relatively low root material compared to its similar purple top turnip, which is producing a larger amount of root material. So what's the importance of, why am I bringing this up? If you are intending to graze and not necessarily remove and feed that root material, you're going to want to select for a variety or type that is going to preferentially grow more shoot material. I think that that's just going to make your life easier if you don't want to deal with those tubers. If that is your focus, several things are important. One is, again, to select the right type and variety, but also to think about your seeding densities. Okay, and then WSU Mount Vernon, you can see we had much higher yields. Now, keep in mind, at Jubilee, this is where we had the 5 times seeding densities than our targeted rates. And as you can see, again, kale is basically all shoot, and our Paja is really like roughly 75% shoot material compared to a much greater portion with purple top. And you can see that the Brassicas tended to outproduce in terms of dry weight yield compared to the fodder beets. And then in 2012, yes, you're looking at the same exact scale, 0 to 16 tons per hectare. As you can see that we were down significantly in 2012. And what's going on here is that if for those that can remember, 2012 was a really dry year. We did not irrigate these crops. So that's a really important point. And in fact, it was so much less that it was half the amount of precipitation in 2012 as compared to 2011. And this had several different impacts on the crop. One, Maris kale was much better able to maintain its productivity under those greater conditions. But in comparison to something like silage corn, our yields were on par in 2011 when we compare that to total tonnage to silage corn, but that was just not the case in 2012. Now, what's interesting is that the yields, if we average across the years, we take these variations into effect, that overall that the yields were similar to what has been reported in other scientific papers. So it goes to show that basically we can grow things as well as they do in areas like the UK.
Chris?
Yeah.
When you're talking about that rainfall, was that half the rainfall just during the growing season or half for the year?
Half while the crop was in the ground, from seed to harvest. Does that make sense, Joe?
Yeah, I just wanted to
clarify. Yeah.
Make sure that was the comparison. So because it was for the year, it could even be more.
Yeah.
Half.
Yeah, and I mean, it's I will point out that at WSU Mount Vernon, they were planted literally in the same field, but in different sections. So the soil didn't really vary that much either. But again, this is not irrigated. These are under non-irrigated conditions. So my suggestion is basically to irrigate. And that's if you can. Some people just can't do that, or they don't have the time to worry about it. So any other questions? Okay, so I don't know, Renee, did you happen to provide, I know it's a little scientifically, but did you provide access to that paper that we published?
Not the one you provided today, but the one you have online.
The one that Joe sent you a while ago.
Oh, I did not. I forgot.
Okay, we can circulate that because what I don't want to do is there's a lot of information about feed, the quality in there. And or there's more information that I'm going to present here. And if people want to reference that, we can send them to that. But I was just going to point out a couple things. And Joe, this would be a great time for you to chime in. We look at crude protein. Concentrations range from at Jubilee anywhere from 8% up to 20%. And both fodder beets and fodder beets had a much lower overall crude protein compared to the rest of those crops. But interestingly enough, at WSU Mount Vernon, there was no difference in crude protein statistically between all of the crops. If we look at ADF and NDF, Jubilee, there were higher levels than at NREC. I'm not really sure how to explain that. But for those that are interested in this, kale had a higher ADF and NDF, ADF compared to all of the other crops, and that was statistically significant. And then purple top and kale also had a higher NDF compared to the rest of the crops. And this goes along in line with what is in some of the literature sources, that brassicas tend to have those higher values. So just to kind of summarize what we learned from these trials was obviously the yields varied a lot year to year, and I would chalk it up to precipitation differences, because the seeding rates were about the same, and other than that, it was managed identically. And as I mentioned, irrigation could likely overcome this, and that a lot of these crops, particularly fodder beets, have a high moisture content that can lead to digestive issues, particularly for ruminants. So that's just something you have to be cognizant of. And I mentioned the issue with feeding brassicas. And really, I think what I learned from Joe and working through and developing that paper is that these crops are really better suited as a supplement or an additive to traditional feeds rather than a standalone. And in some cases, they definitely should not be a standalone. But the quality is a good source for an animal such as cattle. And the possibility of grass strip and pasture renovation strategy might fit the best. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that if I have a minute at the end of this. And we felt that sort of surprisingly that a grain drill was better suited, and in some cases people have better access to that type of equipment than a precision vegetable seeder. And the need for mechanized planting, maintenance, and harvest is really important. I can't emphasize this enough. You need to have a plan for that, because if you plan on going out and hand weeding a lot of things, it could be problematic. The harvest component, you can get really quite interested, particularly, and you can avoid that altogether if you're just grazing them. Renee, do I have about 5 more minutes? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to point out some interesting things here. One is there was a paper published in 2008 out of the UK where they took fodder beets and they mixed them in a 2/3, 1/3 ratio with silage corn. And what they found is it increased total energy concentration in the overall mix. And it resulted in a higher fat percentage in the milk. And so this is an example of where these alternative crops not necessarily are standalone, but can be a nice additive to an overall feed mix. And also there was some work done in England in 2009 where grass silage, or green chop as some people refer to it, was co-planted or co-mixed with fodder beets. And they did this 1/3 to 2/3 ratio as well. And they found that, and they utilized it with dairy cows, and there was a real benefit to the cows. And it lowered their overall production costs. I'm sort of interested in how they calculated that, because they don't describe it too much, because I would imagine that adding fodder beets would just really add cost, but apparently it didn't. So this information led to some conversations with folks at Jubilee, and we sort of were thinking, and this happened in 2013, as they showed more interest in these crops, but they wanted to see how they could better fit it into their production system. And So we did some trial work. This was, unreplicated, but it was to try to see if this would even work, where there were grass strips planted in between. In this case, I think these are, this is Pasture, that hybrid Brassica. And a couple things were attempted here. One is that when they went to chop this grass, they chopped everything together and they mixed it together. And they stored it together, and then they would feed it later on. But two, the other thing was strip grazing, and they placed movable fence tape across, and they allowed the animals access. If you're looking away from us, and they moved down the field, and so the animals had equal access to these brassicas and grasses at the same time. And the idea is that they would sort of co-mingle or co-eat that at the same time. I followed up with Eric about this, and they did find that the animals were bouncing around between. There was some concern that they would stand just in the brassicas and eat, but they did, and they did this with sheep. But the other thing that came up, which is kind of interesting, I know a lot of people struggle in Western Washington, particularly at smaller scales, at renovating their pasture. They just can't find a good time slot to do that. And so the idea, and Jubilee struggles with this as well, and excuse me. And what the idea was here, similar to what we saw here, is that we would take a portion of a pasture out and plant it into these crops, with the idea that you're still getting productivity out of that ground. And in the case of something like Pasture, it could be for a relatively short time period. And then you could go back in, whether you need to line, whether you need to add manure, whatever you need to do to renovate that pasture, and then reseed that into it, as opposed to just losing that productivity for a time period. And so this is an early on shot. This is a little bit later. And this is sort of towards the end of the season. And you can see that the crops have fully matured. And in this case, we've got kale, we've got fodder beets, and also brassicas. But he took half of this particular pasture out and put it into these alternative crops. And what he did the following year was reverse that. He took the following 50% out of grass, amended it as he needed, and put those alternative crops into it. So maybe those are some strategies that might work for you. And that is all I have. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to handle them.
Chris, you mentioned the need for weed control. Do you have a few quick bullet points or suggestions on what might be the most successful approaches there?
Yeah, so if you're planting in rows like with a vegetable seeder, cultivation equipment is going to, if you're comfortable using herbicides, that's an option, right? And because these are also grown for for human consumption, there are a number of herbicides registered, so that is an opportunity. If you're not, cultivation is going to be your tool, or your key. And what's really important there is if you're growing in rows like that, you're going to have a lot more opportunities for specialized cultivation equipment, whether it's coulters, you name it, S-tines. In terms of when you get in a situation where I'll pull this back up real quick. Cody, I'm almost done. When you're dealing with a situation, hang with me for a second. When you're dealing in a situation like this, where you're not going to be able to get in equipment, or even early on, there's some really nice cultivation equipment. There's a tool called a flex tine that's used actually in a lot of different crops, but it's pretty soft on the crops, and it kind of just will rip out those really early on weeds. That's just an example, but obviously this is a much different situation than this is, where you've got a lot of inter-row space, soil that you can move back and forth and bury and uproot weeds. So, but of course, this canopy is going to close a lot sooner and be competitive than one like this. Does that sound good, Joe?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, wanna move on to any other questions? Okay, so Cody Wood is calling us from Oregon, and you want to give a little spiel about yourself, Cody, and what you're doing and have done?
You're on mute. You're
Yeah,
muted.
unmute yourself.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah,
So I'm a sheep farmer in Oregon. We also raise some feeder cattle, and then we raise feeder cattle in kind of near Oakland, California. So a lot of portable fencing, temporary fence around farm fields or public land. Kind of a lot of opportunistic grazing, I guess, is what we do. Also growing fodder beets. Grow quite a lot of kale, and then a bit of Swedes and turnips as well. Just trying to take the whole year and smooth it out with forage.
okay. Ready to go on to your PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, same one. I don't know why it is this, so pick which one. Okay, we're ready, Cody.
All right. Is it working? So with all of us, we're trying to make our farms produce the most amount of material. And so the fodder crops can help that a lot. We can increase our production in the summer, and we can also increase our production for winter feeding. So you see the traditional grass curve there, most being in the spring and a bump in the fall. Bump's pretty weak in my neighborhood in the fall, but sometimes it's better than others. But with the fodder crops, we can start to kind of fill in those holes in the year, and we can actually raise the amount of material and animals we can grow on our farms. So yeah, I found them to be very, very useful for my operation. Next slide.
I think you have to put it in presenter mode.
Where?
What a pain.
Actually, hey Renee, see the you have slideshow up, but you kind of like exited out of it. It looks like.
Right arrow. Yeah, it won't come up.
Can you,
See there's a button there in the middle that says resume slideshow. It's like in the toolbar.
We even tried to practice this earlier.
No. Controls now. Okay. There we go. Woohoo. Okay, we got it.
All right, so summer feed, winter feed, those are our holes. So what works? On to the next slide. Let's see. So winter feed. So obviously, we all know hay costs quite a lot of money. I try to feed almost none if I can. So stockpile forage is great, except for it takes a lot of space on your farm. So it takes kind of production out of the growing time of the year off your farm. So it's not a bad system, but once again, it takes space from your farm. Is that a train?
yep.
Yes.
All right, feel free to ask questions all along if you guys like. All right, crops grown for winter grazing can be the cheapest if done right, but the agronomy is tough. Just as Chris described, it's really tough to get those high yields. Just farming vegetables is difficult in general, and it's another skill besides livestock grazing that a lot of us livestock grazers don't have perfectly down. And then graze off the farm. I do this quite a lot, but essentially move your animals to farm fields, cover crops on farmland or crop aftermath. I've done that quite a lot, and it's pretty cheap. And you know, if you're Western Washington, you can put animals out in a field that's your neighbor's farm field. You know, it can be a cheap way to winter your animals. And then the last one is ship animals to a warmer climate, which isn't easy or readily available, but you know, say grass in California is not terribly expensive. You can get your foot in the door, and it's, you know, a great way to winter your animals. A bit far, but once again, you know, the freight's cheaper than buying hay, that's for sure. Oh, next one. All right. So yeah, this is some of the examples of what I've done. The picture to the left is sheep grazing chard, which is a little tricky. There's a lot of oxalates in it, but I got away with it pretty well. And essentially the cannery that was going to cut it or whatever couldn't get to it. So I got kind of opportunistically got to graze it off for them. I think I made about a half pound a day on lambs in the summertime, which was really good. And then I gave them, I think, a third of the weight, whatever that was worth. So not a bad deal for both of us. The second one is a vineyard, and they've actually paid me to graze their vineyard. So you can see it's loaded with subclover and annual ryegrass. So in the spring, there's lots of feed, but that was pretty good feed. With vineyards, you're always waiting on bud break, and as soon as bud break happens, they kick you off real fast. So it's not, vineyards weren't the funnest, but it's definitely grass, and if they pay you a bit, it can be, you know, some very cheap grass. And then the last one is white clover seed field. So essentially, the farmers have us graze it in the spring. It helps it, I guess, they readily tiller, and essentially the sheep pull out the roots of the new plant, so it limits competition for seed production. So somewhere in April or May, we might get to graze those clover fields for a month or so, which is very, very hot feed. About 10 lambs per acre and roughly half a pound of growth per day. So pretty good production. Oh, next one. Let's see, my operation, I already kind of talked about this, but sheep and cattle in the Willamette Valley and calves in California feed less than 10 bales of hay a year. In California, sometimes at the start of our season, the owner will really want to own calves and have them in California. So he'll pay for the hay and we'll just feed it for him. But for the most part, we don't feed hay there. Next slide. All right, fodder beets. So on the left is a picture from New Zealand. They've got it figured out pretty well. On the right, my production in Burns, Oregon. So this is Eastern Oregon. Pretty tough place, Burns. They don't grow corn there. They don't grow much but alfalfa. And we got 6 tons of dry matter per acre, which matched some of their good alfalfa yields. So that was pretty encouraging. We didn't get the farming perfect. I think we could have got it up to 8 or 10 tons if we had done it perfect or better. So that was pretty fun. Oh, there's a rutabaga in the middle of there. So do you see the rutabaga? It's the second one from the left. And the rest of them are fodder beets. And those are 50-pound dogs for scale. Anyway, so the next slide. All right, that's a picture from New Zealand. But yeah, yields comparable to corn. What's great about fodder beets is they're extremely digestible, whereas corn, you know, you have digestible parts with some pretty serious stalk. Fodder beets, there's a lot of power to them. No harvesting cost if you graze them, but the grazing is quite tricky and it does take time, so it's not free. And then very high feed quality. This is my costs from Burns, whatever, what it costs to make fodder beets. So
Is this per acre, Cody?
yes, per acre, and then at the bottom is the total per acre. So this is giving them every advantage. You know, there's, you know, chemicals, hay, irrigation. You know, we're pretty serious about it. Not that we didn't screw up a lot, but we tried hard. So. And I'm sure you could kind of take some of those away, chisel some of those costs down. But anyway, that's a pretty fair pretty fair representation of it's a pretty expensive crop. Luckily, we didn't have to add lime over there. You know, it's naturally like a pH of 8. So high in boron, high in salt. The fodder beets, turns out they really like that. So it's actually a really good fit for the high desert fodder beets. You want to hit the next slide? All right, challenges. I would say weeds were the worst. I think that was annual kochia that we had out there. That was a pretty weak spot in the field, but yeah, the weeds will take over, so you really need to be on top of them. I live far from Burns, Oregon, so I didn't get to monitor it the way I wanted. And the farmer, it was a bigger farm, and you could say that they were a lower priority, just like maybe Chris's experience. So bugs are an issue. I think we had the cucumber beetles and possibly flea beetles. I can't remember exactly. Rabbits definitely chew on them. They go for the root, so you'll find the top laying to the side of a chewed on root. Actually, that's in the next picture. They can kill cows, acidosis being the biggest problem. So you have to move them on very slowly with transition. And that can take some effort. And then freezing, you know, Burns was very, very cold. So, you know, freezing was an issue. And they held up okay, but not perfect. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, there's some rabbit damage. Yep, they're kind of just a ball of sugar. So rabbits, anything loves them. Deer. Let's see. It turned out not to be a terrible problem in Eastern Oregon. I thought the rabbits might just take the whole crop, but they couldn't eat enough, luckily, over 40 acres to cause me too much trouble. And then California, we've got ground squirrels there, and that could be a real issue. We'll know here pretty soon, but we're kind of in a drought right now, and the ground squirrels have taken a lot of tops off. Still learning in California. And then next slide. Transition and supplement. So they recommend you to transition over 14 days. I did it over 20 days because I was pretty nervous. And I think we got it pretty right. None of the cattle seemed to be losing condition. They were always doing fine. What we learned in Burns is that it was too cold to feed kind of the bare minimum of supplement. So our supplement was hay, kind of a nice orchard grass hay. And we had to switch to alfalfa midway because the calves did not grow at all. They kept their condition. They looked okay, but they were not growing when we weighed them. So we went from 2 pounds of orchard grass hay to 5 pounds of alfalfa with as much fodder beet as they could eat. And then they started growing at 2 pounds a day. And this was January in Burns, so that's, you know, no small feat. That was pretty good, we thought. And then, yeah, so here's kind of our numbers. We got, what was it? Sorry, this isn't our numbers. If we could get 10 tons of fodder beets per acre, they would roughly be a cost of $80 per ton. And that's fed, you know, that's by paying for somebody to move the fence even. So that's as fed. Hay, I mean, everybody's got a hay field, whatever that's worth to you. You know, hay can be 100 to 300 a ton. And then a TMR, you know, will be something above $200 a ton. So essentially, the fodder beets are a very cheap, high quality feed. Mix them with some straw to maintain cows, or mix them with some alfalfa to grow calves. But your cost per ton of feed is very low compared to some of the other feed stuffs. Next slide. Okay, so this is Burns, Oregon, and you know, when we got around to, say, the end of December, that's what the fields look like. The tops are all melted off. You see a little green in the center of the bulb, but essentially they're kind of dying or wilting away. But the cattle are still eating them, and they're kind of doing, I mean, the cattle did good until the end, but yeah, you can see that the beets were fading away. the picture on the left, that's El Centro, California. So 70 degrees every day through the winter, the beets are doing just fine. Kind of interesting contrast. What else was I going to say? I guess I just go to the next slide. So that's what a frozen beet looks like. I think at the end, it was the 1st of February, I think there was 30% or so rotten fodder beets. We didn't measure it carefully, but it kind of felt that way. So there's a lot of good ones, but obviously a lot of them were dead and rotting away. So the variety you pick, so the nicest varieties for growing calves would be a low dry matter. Sheep can eat these readily as well. They also stick out of the ground more. Those sheep will cup them into the ground, but they won't really dig them out. Cattle can actually pull them out of the ground. So in warmer climates, something that's out of the ground and a lot softer would be what you would want. And in cold climates like Burns, you want something that resembles more of a sugar beet. You want it kind of a higher dry matter, so less water weight, and then into the ground more. And I think that'll winter better. Another strategy that would be, I think, pretty smart would be to start your season, say October, November, with a soft version or soft variety. And as the season progresses, the varieties get harder, so that, at the end you're grazing, say, 18% dry matter, kind of a more sugar beet type fodder beet. Then you can kind of go through the winter while, you have an easy transition with the calves chewing on soft beets. Once they learn the game, then they're on to the harder stuff that can handle the winter. And you guys are all in Western Washington, so maybe some of the lower dry matter varieties would work well there. Next slide. All right, so California rangeland. We're on stuff that isn't fenced, so we build temporary fence around it. And that really lowers the cost. Also, it lowers the competition. Not everybody wants to build electric fence over, say, 1,000 acres through hills and oak trees and stuff. Makes the lease cheap, and with adequate rain, it can be a pretty profitable deal. Grass in the winter is pretty desirable. You guys have a fairly mild winter, I think, but I'm sure the grass grows pretty slow. So it's nice to have a growing season and warm weather, through the winter months. Next slide. There's a picture of our farm. So our job here is to keep the cattle out of this reservoir, and you can see a line kind of at the bottom of those hills where we have a fence built around those. So anyway, interesting project there, and lots of grass, but not without kind of a lot of work. Next slide. All right, summer feed. So what to do when the grass loses quality? See-through grasses, lambs, calves, and humans all prefer 60 to 70 degrees temperatures. And you can't switch the sheep. They're going to stay there, but you can switch the grasses. So what I do is we go to kale, chicory, and clover. Those are kind of our summer species. So next slide. All right, so chicory, plantain, and white clover, that's kind of the base of my perennial pasture. So I'm out in farm fields in the wintertime mostly, and then in the summer, my permanent acres are all kind of in this mix, and it does good in dry land. It also does good with irrigation. It doesn't lose quality, so it's always going to be a fairly high TDN, and it's super high protein. You can get lambs to grow somewhere between 0.35 and 0.5 pounds a day. I don't have it perfectly figured out yet, but it's better than anything else we have through the summertime in Oregon. It's also got a very large window to graze. It's very forgiving. So, grass, you have kind of a week-long period to get the good out of it for growing lambs or lactating ewes, lactating cows. After that, it starts to get lignified, gets too tall, too rank, and it's just not as forgiving. This stuff, you can kind of graze it when you come around to it. You don't have to be so on the ball. You don't have to mow it as much. chicory can bolt. You want to be on top of that, but anyway, it seems to maintain its quality. And then, yeah, excellent protein. Oh, one thing I've learned with the chicory is if you're using irrigation, you want to cut the water a couple days before. It has too much water weight, and so the first couple years I was growing it, my lambs were not growing fast enough. We had one farm where we couldn't get the water system around quick enough, and it was always kind of half droughted, and the lambs grew the fastest on that farm the whole summer. So we actually found a farm in New Zealand doing the same thing at very large scale, like 15,000 acres, or sorry, 15,000 lambs. And essentially they were cutting the water on their pivots, groups of 500 lambs as the lambs came around, a few days beforehand. That was encouraging to see. Next slide. All right, so these are some of my paddocks. On the left is dry land, chicory, plantain, white clover. That's kind of in the middle of spring. And yeah, it's pretty fun. The one on the right is red clover, and it's hunter forage brassica. So actually it was a seed production field of red clover, and the farmer on the last year let me just direct drill. He took a silage crop and then let me direct drill brassica into it, and pretty good lamb feed through the summer. Next one.
So where is your back fence line on this, where the sheep are packed in? Is that their whole paddock?
No, I'm shifting them to the next paddock. So they're just crossing the line right there.
Got it.
So I got a border collie pushing them into that field.
Okay.
So they got plenty of room.
Wow, that's tight.
Problems with chicory. So high water content is a problem with chicory. You want it to be wilted if you can, or I guess too much water can be an issue where the sheep won't grow on it very well. High protein, so it's very high in protein. The whole mix will have a lot of protein in it. Not going to be very suitable to cattle, probably because of the protein levels. And then it starts a little slower in the spring. So your grass is kind of the best in the winter. It's good to be grazing grass through the wintertime. And then as we get into late April, May, then the chicory kind of takes off. Right now, though, the sheep do like the chicory, but boy, they'll really knock it back. They'll take the center right out of it, almost to the ground. And it seems like it doesn't persist if you winter on it much. So if you can kind of hold off until summertime, I think it'll last longer. Still, once again, I'm still learning. I've been growing it about 5 years, but yeah, it seems like it's more of a summertime thing than a wintertime. And then next slide. Forage brassica. So this is my favorite summer crop. The lambs always do well on it, and it just works. I mean, I don't have to spray much chemicals. I don't spray any chemicals in the Willamette Valley, but essentially it's no fertilizer, no herbicide, and no bug spray, and you get pretty good results. So and the lambs grow very reliably, a half pound a day. Last summer I did was 14 lambs per acre for 90 days, growing a half pound a day. So it was pretty good, I thought. One problem with it is you have to, it's an annual, so you have to till it. It's good to do on a rotation on your farm if you have that option. My preference would be, say, 5 years of chicory, plantain, white clover, a year of kale, knock out some of the thistles, and then with the tillage, and then back into chicory, plantain, and white clover if I had my way.
So are you irrigating this?
Yes. Yep. I've tried it dry land, and I've never been thrilled with it in a dry land setting. So I tried it a few times now, and it's just never. But with irrigation in the summer, it's pretty fun. Next slide. Let's see. So here's some cattle systems for growing in the heat. This is chicory, alfalfa, and phalaris in Australia. Essentially, when it gets hot, it's hard to grow cattle, and a lot of the grass species don't hold up good enough. There's some stuff in Georgia maybe, but yeah, it seems like it's quite a trick to grow cattle through the summertime when it gets up, above 80. Okay, next slide. This is in Northern California. I thought this was pretty smart, but essentially it's alfalfa and orchard grass alternated. So with your seed drill, you take the small box, put alfalfa seed in it, and then the large seed box you put, and you have your tubes alternating. Alfalfa doesn't like a lot of competition when it starts, and the grass, this way the grass doesn't take over. It seemed to be working pretty well for them. I can't remember what they said their calves growth rates were, but it was somewhere around 2 pounds a day, maybe a bit better. So pretty good. Next slide. Fencing. So essentially this is kind of my life, but we do electric fencing quite a lot. In the back of that Ford Ranger is enough fencing for 300 acres. So you can load up a Ford Ranger with everything you need to build 300 acres of fence. I thought that was pretty efficient. We use battery powered units to charge the fences. If you get everything right and there's not grass or brush on the fence, you can get those voltages up kilovolts to above 7 to 10, even with a fairly small charger. I'm always a fan, if you're plugging it into a wall, to go as big as possible, maybe 3 or 4 times the recommendation of what charger you should use. But if you're using batteries, changing them is a chore. So I use a Patriot P60 or a SpeedRite 6000. It's like a 6 joule charger. So big fields will use the Patriot 6 joule charger, and smaller fields will use this Patriot P60. I don't like Gallagher chargers much. I've had bad luck with them. And then you'll see my brace post there. So we'll brace in that fashion. So 2 T-posts, that's your corner. And we use donuts. On the far right is our winder. That's how we have a hydraulic winder with a little gas motor that winds it in. We use 14 gauge smooth wire, so we don't use high tensile on the temporary stuff because it's really springy. The soft wire rolls in nice. You can work with it. You can tie it good. So that's our system. We use 4-foot fiberglass posts, but if we're in the hills in California, we use 4.5 foot for the cattle, just because of the topography. It's up and down. Next slide. There's our donuts. There's another example of a corner we do. So this 2 posts bent kind of out, and then we use the clips that are as close to the post as possible, and then you can turn them to the outside, go around the corner that way. This stuff goes up pretty quick. So I think today was pretty exceptional, but my workers took down a 40-acre field and put up, I want to say, about 200 acres of fence after that today, all within 8 hours. So pretty good. Next slide. All right. So this is our worker, Jacob. He's in California. On the left is this first day on the job. On the right is 2 years later. So pretty good results.
Exercise program.
Yeah, we've had a lot of posts, that's for sure. Next slide, please. Our temporary water systems. So we use this black poly line. Essentially, when you're out on farm fields, hauling water is a terrible chore. So if you can find it within a quarter mile from the nearest house, you just run it through the ditch, down the street, into the field, and have put out a water trough. But you try to pump water as much as you can. You don't want to haul water. You can get away with it. So, water troughs, black poly line. I think we use 1 inch most everywhere. In California, we go up hills, essentially, and we use, I think, 1 1/4 inch or 1.5 inch. Can't remember exactly. So in California, we have that reservoir. We'll pump water up the hill into a tank and then gravity feed to a trough or a couple of troughs, depending on what we can get away with. We have one tank feeding 4 troughs, but for the most part, we just kind of shoot it straight up the hill and then into one water trough, kind of at a nice point. Just a small Honda pump is all we use. Maybe 100 feet up into the hills, something like that. I can't remember exactly what our elevation was. Once again, we do this all with little pickups. Next slide. All right, what makes feed expensive? Hay is expensive. Fencing too much is expensive, especially permanent fencing around, sparse paddocks or fencing around small pieces of land. Long, narrow fields can be more expensive with fencing. So big squares or big circles are the best shapes, and lots of forage inside the fence really helps with paying for them. Labor, just always, labor and feed are your biggest expenses in this business. So irrigation is a chore. So if you're not getting, I guess if I'm using irrigation, the lambs need to be growing 0.4 pounds a day or better, at a density of maybe 10 to 15 per acre. If I can do that, then it works all right. If I can't do that, then I need to probably find a different system or just sell the lambs as feeders. Poor performance is very expensive. When you have money into, say, a fodder beet crop, kale, irrigation, labor, all that stuff, you want to be going full speed. So it's good to monitor your animals and see where you're at and keep things moving. Next slide. Makes feed cheap. Low labor, high performance, low inputs, and forage density. So I think that's it. One more slide. All right, this is my contact information. If you guys have any questions later, feel free to call me up or reach out. And yeah, always love to chat with people about forage and ranching.
Anybody in the room or online have any questions for Cody?
Cody, this is Joe. So we have a lot of rain here in the winter. So we might be dealing with as much as 30 or 40 inches. Any experience with any of these under heavy moisture conditions?
Yeah, in the southland of New Zealand, and yeah, it sure can be terrible. So I would say that would be quite difficult if you're trying to graze the fodder beets in your climate. You definitely want to be on the lightest soils, rockiest soils, probably. And then, boy, there's some strategies the guys in New Zealand are using, but it'll be quite a trick. Yeah, yes, good luck on that. Are your soils mostly heavy or light?
Variable. Yeah, it depends on the location.
Yikes. Yeah, so I chose to try this in Eastern Oregon, where I knew I wouldn't get much precipitation, and there's a few muddy days where it started to thaw out, and that was kind of annoying, but boy, if I tried it here where I'm at in Oregon, it would be pretty messy, I think. Once again, people in New Zealand are doing it in pretty wet situations, so I would try to reach out to folks in the southland of New Zealand or somewhere like that.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Cody? Okay, Joe, do you want to talk about nutrition or?
Yeah, so just some general comments. I think, you need to decide, what you're feeding, what critters you're feeding. And so I think that has a lot to do with which one of the crops you're going to pick, because if you want a lot of forages, then obviously one that'll grow a lot of forage is going to be pretty valuable. Some of these protein levels that go above 18, 20, 22%, it's a lot of excess protein for the animals. And at some point it does cost energy for the animals actually to get rid of that nitrogen. So it's an energy expense to the animals, so that's not good. And I think, as Chris and Cody both said, just transition these animals on. Back when we used to do a lot of feeding trials where we would vary our diets quite a bit, and have cows on one diet and then switch them over to another diet, we would transition them over on a period of at least 4 days. And those were animals that were getting a lot of grain in their diets anyhow, so they were somewhat conditioned to it. So I think giving your animals a lot of time to transition over is good. And the point about it being a supplemental feed rather than the primary feed, even when you're putting them out on pasture, maybe give them access to hay before they're going out. So that'll kind of somewhat limit how much they're going in. Chris mentioned some things about sulfur. The issue there with high sulfur is you get a disease called polioencephalomalacia. Anyhow, causes neurological disorders in the animals and can get some blindness attacks, which is just a lack of muscle function. So there are some kind of nasty things, and so loss of animals is certainly hits the bottom line. But the notes I wrote down is they're going to grow well, so that's the first thing you got to figure out. It's going to grow well where you're trying to grow it, and then adjust your feeding component, and then realize that if you have the root, that's the part that's got a lot of carbohydrate on it, and it's the one that's going to give you the greatest chance of having some issues with acidosis in the rumen and so forth, because it's those readily available carbohydrates that'll kick off the acid production in the rumen. So again, if you're feeding root crop, you want to get them onto that gradually too. So there's just some general things. One thing that I was thinking, Chris, back whenever, and I don't know if you had a chance to get any feel for this or not, but with your row spacing, did you, and my guess is you did, you saw a change in the amount of shoot to root ratio, and therefore that probably changed your quality. I'm guessing you got lower fiber content, probably higher protein content than those.
Yeah, if you dig into that paper, it shows up. I mean, we didn't perfectly control the situation. We were, trying to really vary it across it was sort of a result of using different equipment. But yeah, if you look at particularly the 2011 Mount Vernon data, and compare that to the Jubilee data, you can see the differences there. But the other thing is that there's a point at which you start getting too close that the plants just there's too much plant material per area, right? That is your question, Joe?
Yeah. So there's a happy medium in there. Cody, planting density, have you played with that much, or?
I guess mine was 4.5 inches per plant and 22-inch row spacing. This was a special beet drill that I planted with, and talking to some of the guys in New Zealand, they are trying to get their equipment to more of a grid pattern. So essentially, if you're not mechanically cultivating it, there's no reason to have it in rows, and they're moving to more of a grid pattern. So they want lots of space per plant, just like you said.
So with our no-till drill, you can even almost unplug some of the nozzles and then widen out your spacing that way. I know we've had people cross hatch, they plant both directions. So maybe that would accomplish that?
You'd probably have to remove some plants there somehow, with cultivation or something, but it'd be tough to get the seeds the right spacing with a no-till drill probably.
Yeah, and I mean, some people, just for note, some people will take a drill like that and go into a standing, recently mowed or grazed pasture and drill in, like a turnip or brassica. And it can have some other benefits, and getting that taproot in there actually helps with some soil compaction levels, if you can't go in and work up a pasture. And I know that's fairly popular in places like New Zealand.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. And Joe Harrison, you didn't introduce yourself and say you. I mean, I introduced you, but.
So I've been with WSU here in Gallup for, that's my 36th year, so maybe too long. But anyhow, trained as a dairy nutritionist, but get involved in projects like this, collaborated with Chris a little bit. I didn't realize it was that long ago that we ran that study. So
I know. It was 10 years ago.
But do a lot of nutrient management work too. So work on both ends of the cow. So So, and again, located here in Puyallup, so I'm a resource that's available as well.
Oh, fodder beet seed. So it's really tough to get. If you guys need any help getting it, I can help. So there's just not a lot of it available in this country.
How well does that last from year to year if you've got some stockpiled?
Oh, good question. I try to get it from a seed company, 2 seed companies in Europe, and I just get it flown over. So.
Yeah. But if you had some and you already had it for a year, it should still be okay.
Oh, good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of sugar beet guys would probably know something about it.
Well, I'll send out all the materials to everybody that participated online, plus I'll send you guys all the actual study or all the results that Joe and Chris came up with, and send you the PowerPoints and all that sort of stuff. So, okay, thanks for coming. Please sign in if you didn't already, and
Great job, guys.
if you need more materials. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cody.
Yep.
Thanks, Chris.
Goodbye.
Bye. And Robin and I and Paul and Allie are all available to come visit your farms and give you extra resources. We have a chock full schedule this spring, so if you don't get our newsletter already, it's got the most recent class schedule, and make sure you sign up to get on the newsletter. Or you had the opportunity when you registered, so hopefully you did that. Okay. Did you get all the materials?
No.
Okay, I'll make extra copies.
Okay.
I think we
I thought
really need
that's
one.
okay.
I'll email
I
it to
worked
you.
at that Terminal City, I could learn
Oh, okay.
some recognize the heading. But they weren't growing the seeds, except we were growing strawberries and raspberries.
Can you grow that, like, see, I just want some for extra